Hi, Kevin Green here. Welcome to Pathways to the Past. I'm starting this video at my shop in downtown Seymour, Artistic Impressions, because I have something here that I want to show you. One of my favorite things to do is to study old maps, especially if it's pertaining to local history. So I've got a map to show you here. This is a bird's eye view of Seymour, Indiana in 1886. And it's drawn in three-dimensional perspective. So the idea is that if you were floating in a balloon south of Seymour in 1886 and looked down, this is what the view you would have of the city. I've got some reflection from the overhead lights there a little bit. You've probably seen copies of this map around. There's a copy of it in the Seymour Library, and there's a copy of it at the City Hall. But those are reproductions that were sold at one point. This is actually an original 1886 copy in what's probably its original frame. I took it apart and put conservation backing and conservation glass over it. So if we come in closer, and I actually showed this view in my first video about the O&M shops, you can see the first O&M roundhouse, the 9-stall one there. Get a good idea of what it would have looked like. Come up here to 2nd Street, and you get past Pine Street right there, and that's basically the edge of the city at the time. 2nd Street turns into Brownstown Road, because that's the way you would have went if you were headed west out of Seymour. And off of there, off of what would be 2nd Street later, here's this interesting thing called Cyclone Driving Park. You can see a half-mile racetrack and other facilities there. So that's the subject of this video, is the Cyclone Driving Park. We're going to get into exactly what it was and what went on there. Kind of an interesting story, so I'll find a place outside and we'll talk about it. I'll be filming today's video at Harmony Park on West 2nd Street. This is the outdoor venue that's a part of the Brooklyn Pizza Company and Seymour Brewing Company. This is where they have their outdoor activities, including live music and nicer weather. There's the covered stage right there. And in nice weather, this is a very pleasant place to sit and listen to live music and have some good pizza and craft beer. So let me find a seat and we'll get started. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is just how connected the people were in the pre-automobile days to horses. Horses were the source of transportation, a source of power and working, in farming and construction and delivery services and that sort of thing. It would be compared to today, people's relationships with their vehicles. So, everybody seems to own a or multiple vehicles, and in the same way in the pre-automobile days, people would have owned at least a horse and multiple horses. And in the same way, today, especially when guys get together, it's not unusual for conversations to turn to their vehicle, modifications they might have done to them, who's the fastest or the quickest or the whatever. And in the same way, back in the 1800s, it was normal for when guys would get together to brag about their horses, which one was the biggest or the tallest, the strongest, the fastest. And this led to more well-to-do people going out and intentionally purchasing higher grade race horses, or horses that have a race history to them, or races in their lineage, so that they would have a source of bragging rights, I suppose. But especially the more well-to-do people that could afford to do this. And eventually, and this is not just here, but all over the United States, there would be what you would call the gentlemen would form horse associations or horse clubs, where they would get together and talk about their horses, basically. And then that led to, of course, you would need a place to prove your bragging of being the fastest horse. And so a lot of times they would find or have built private racetracks to race their horses. They would have a set course, and they would time them so that they would have a basis to know which one would be faster, that sort of thing. So the first person I would like to talk about is a fellow named Jacob Peter. His family lived in the northern part of Jackson County. As a matter of fact, the Peter Switch area that's called today was named after the Peter family that he comes from. But in the pre-Seymour days, he and some of his brothers were big in business dealings in the Rockford area, which was thriving at the time. And then the 1870s, he bought property or just outside of Seymour, just to the west edge of the city of Seymour. And like most of the land in the area, it had belonged to Meady Shields, who had passed away in 1866. So the land went to his heirs, and they slowly sold it off. But the particular farmland that he bought was actually some of where Meady's residence actually was. It's a rather large farm which takes up most of what's called the Boulevards area today. So the borders of the farm went to the east at about where Pine Street is today, which would have been the western edge of the city of Seymour. And went to the west to about where the Bonfang ditch is at this time. And then the width of it would go from, on the north side, the 6th Street area, and even a little bit beyond there in a couple of spots, and then south to the railroad tracks. So it was a rather large piece of property, and he actually moved into the former Meady Shields home, which is not standing anymore. But also to go with that house was the Meady's big brick 2-story barn, which is still standing. It's near the corner of 6th Street and Johnson Street. And so Jacob Peter was one of the ones who was into purchasing what I would say would be high-grade racehorses, which he kept in the big brick barn. So he and some of his gentleman friends, which were some of the business owners around Seymour at the time, formed what they call the Seymour Trotting Club. So they would say that they met at the barn over there and talked horses and that sort of thing. Now the first track that I can find that was built for the Trotting Association to use as a practice and to race each other and to time each other was actually located on Jacob Peter's property. It was between 2nd Street, which was called Brownstown Road at the time, because it was actually outside of the city of Seymour. But it was between what today is 2nd Street and the railroad tracks, so it would be south of 2nd Street. And can't find a whole lot of information about the track as far as the configurations or the size. I'm presuming it was a half-mile course because that seems to be the what most of the tracks were at the time. As far as the exact location, I saw one source that had it toward the east end, like toward the Elm Street area. Another one said it was down where Swain Industry went in later. But there's just not a whole lot of information. There's a couple of indications later that called it the old racetrack or the old showgrounds. But I'm sure it was just a privately owned track for this association to use. So that would have been in the 1870s into the early 1880s. And then a fellow named Robert W. Moore comes into the picture. He wasn't actually a part of the original trotting association, but and I actually can't find out a whole lot of information about him either. But the first indications of his doings I have was a notification in the paper of March of 1883 that mentioned that the grading has started on a new racetrack. And this track would have been on the north side of what became 2nd Street later, basically in what they call the Boulevards area today. That summer of 1883, there's a notice that says that horsemen were practicing daily on the new racetrack, and I'm sure it was one of the horse associations. Whether it was that original one or a new one, I'm not sure. But there's not much else mentioned in it in the papers until the next summer of 1884, and it says that they're building a 7-foot-high fence around Robert Moore's 3-acre racetrack, and he also has planned to build a large stable in that area. So apparently Robert Moore had either leased or just used land. This land would have been some of Jacob Peters' land to build his racetrack, but it was a 3-acre piece of property, and I'm a little surprised that they're able to get a half-mile racetrack into the 3 acres. It must have been all that was on the property at the time. There was a notification in the papers June of 1884 that said the Seymour Browns Baseball Club is to move their baseball field to Robert Moore's racetrack in about 4 weeks' time. So that's the first indication of something other than horse races being held at this facility. In July of 1884, the paper lists the names of Captain Robert Moore's racehorses that he owns. The names are Philo, Seymour Billy, Cyclone, Mary Kay, Nellie Moore, Ben Butler, Alice Monroe, and Jim Blaine. I think he probably was naming them after his friends and family that he knew. In August of 1884, it mentions that the Cyclone Driving Park is nearing completion. I think that probably means that maybe the new facility with the new track and the stables and stuff are about done. It mentions that the half-mile track will be ready to go in about 2 weeks, and that a 2,500 person amphitheater is planned to be built by the fall. This had me confused because I think of an amphitheater as being like a outdoor music venue type thing, but I finally figured out that they're referring to a grandstands which would overlook the racetrack. And so this is the first indications that I have found that they had the public would be going to the track to witness the events and horse races and that sort of thing. In November of 1884, it's mentioned in the paper that for the first time that I could find that the Cyclone Park, which they called it at that time, would make a great fairgrounds. Now we think of the Seymour and Brownstown rivalries today as being centered around high school sporting events, but through the years there were a couple of other rivalries that arose, one of them being trying to get the county court or county seat moved and from Brownstown to Seymour, which of course never happened, and also to have the county fair hosted in Seymour as opposed to Brownstown. That actually did happen from time to time through the late 1800s and in up until 1939 when it moved to the current fairgrounds location and has been there ever since. So it kind of moved back and forth between Seymour and Brownstown for a while. Now the first big thing I find in 1885 was in March the 12th, 1885. In the paper it says, Robert Moore purchased 31 acres from Jacob Peters for $6,200, comprising the Cyclone Driving Park. So Robert Moore definitely had more in mind for his facility than just having horse races there. So he, I think, was leaning at that point toward making it into a big event center and bringing the county fair to this location. So he evidently purchased this property, which included the 3 acres that the track was on and additional acreage around that at the time. In April of 1885, it's again mentioned in the paper that the Seymour Browns Baseball Club selects a plot for a new diamond at Cyclone Park, and it will be ready in about 3 weeks. So that whole summer then, after the diamond was ready, they held baseball games at a regular time periods all that summer. In May, it mentions that the Cyclone Driving Park is in good conditions. July of 1885, it's the first mention I could find of public race horses or horse races at the park. There were it only consisted of 2 separate horses, and it had 3 races. Admission was 10 cents, and they paid out $35 to the winner of each race. Might mention that the horse races would not be like they have at Churchill Downs today with the jockey on the horse. These would have been horses pulling the 2-wheel sulkies where the driver would be seated on the sulky and drive the horse. That's why they're called driving parks. So there seems to have been regular horse races and baseball games played at the park all through the summer of 1885. So exactly where was the park located? I could explain it to you, but I think it would be more fun to take a walk like I did in the other video and actually show you the location. If you can find a current Seymour map that shows the additions to the city of Seymour, you find the Stiegelmeyer addition to the city. That exact addition is what was the park. But I'll show you where that was. So you can see why I chose this particular location to film this video, because here's the Brooklyn Pizza Company. We'll swing around over here, and where that alley is right there would have been the southeast corner of the Cyclone Driving Park. So there would have been a fence line running straight north down that alley as the east border, and then running along 2nd Street to the west would be the front of the park, a fence line. And the entrance was not in the center of the park, it was actually just west of the corner. So probably right in this area was the main entrance to the park that you would go in. And from here we'll go west up 2nd Street, and I'll show you where the other corner would have been. So I just walked west along 2nd Street, past Carter Boulevard, Lee Boulevard, Kessler Boulevard right there, past the Skaggs Builders offices, to this alleyway right behind Skaggs Builders. And this would have been the south west corner of the facility. The fence would have came along 2nd Street and then would have had a corner here and would have headed north up this alleyway. And incidentally, I'm right across from the new Seymour fire station behind me here. So now we'll walk north and I'll show you the north edge of the facility. So I came north past 3rd Street and 4th Street, and now I'm at this kind of odd jog in the street between 4th and 5th Street here on Kessler. And there's an alleyway which runs east and west through here, right at this jog. So the actual corner of the facility would have been right down at the intersection of those two alleys, next to the walk bridge right there, across Von Fang Ditch. And then this would have been the north border of the Cyclone Driving Park. From here we'll go east down this alleyway. This would have been the northern border of the park. So we just came east along the north edge of the park, well, what was the park, back here to, we've passed Lee Boulevard, now we're at Carter. And there's not actually a alley that keeps going, but where the telephone pole is back there between the two houses would have been the northeast corner of the facility. Then it would have headed back south down the alley that's back behind there. And we just walked south back to where we started, back to the what would be the southeast corner of the Cyclone Driving Park facility. So if you live within, or if you did live in the inside perimeter of what we just walked, two things: you live in the Stiegelmeyer addition to the city of Seymour, which was platted in 1923, and you also live on the facility, or on the property which was the Cyclone Driving Park. So there was an announcement in February of 1886 saying that a fellow named James E. Moore was taking over the management of the Cyclone Driving Park. I don't know, I'm sure he was relation to Robert Moore, but I don't know at this time exactly how. What I did find out about him was that he had made his living as a management for traveling musicians and acting companies, and traveled all over the United States before this and even afterwards for a while. So he was taking over the management of the park, and definitely with the idea of making it into a fairgrounds, because it says he plans to build a fence around the track itself and also around the exterior border, put in over 100 horse stalls, which were 12 by 12 feet each. Those went around the outside, the inside of the outside fence, if that makes sense. He's going to put in an agriculture hall and judges stand as well. May of 1886, there's an announcement that the Cyclone Driving Park is open for the season. They had a full season of baseball games and horse races again. Let's see. There was a celebration at that time in June which rivaled the 4th of July celebrations. And it seems to be especially popular in Seymour for whatever reason. It was called the Big Six celebration, and it was celebrated on June the 6th. And in 1886 they held the Big Six celebration at Cyclone Park, and it was quite an affair. There was an industrial parade where local industries and businesses put wagons or floats in the parade, and they marched from downtown to the park with representation of their different businesses. There was a listing of bicycle trick riding. There was a balloon ascension by a Professor Gilbert, where they would send a balloon, probably helium or hydrogen filled, up from the park and let it float off and land someplace else. There were horse races, a band contest, a baseball game, New Albany versus Seymour, which seemed to be a common rivalry between the two cities. And then after dark, there were fireworks. There were estimated around 7,000 people attended this event. July of 1886, the Floral Hall and Agriculture Building are being built. About that time, there was a local fair organization that was formed to specifically get a fair at the Cyclone Park facilities. And I saw some indication that they helped a lot with the expenses of building these buildings, extra buildings, plus some animal stalls that were needed for the fair and some wells dug and that sort of thing. The agreement being that Robert Moore, as the owner of the facility, would get a % of the ticket sales of entrance, and he would also agree to maintain the facility. But they signed a 3-year contract to hold the fair there for 3 years, starting in 1886. So it was in October. And it wasn't actually the county fair. It was each of the bigger towns in the county would have their own fair. So Crothersville had a fair, Brownstown had a fair, Seymour had a fair, and then there would be one big county fair. But they called this one the Big District Fair, and it was held in October of 1886 here for the first time. 1887, again, June the 6th, the Big Six celebration was held at the park again that year. Estimated crowds were between 8,000 and 10,000 people at the facility. October of 1887, the fair was held there again. Later that winter, there became a problem with homeless. They would call them tramps in the paper, but homeless people would break into the facility or get into the facility, and they found that the hayfield horse stalls were good places to spend the time and to try to stay warm. But unfortunately, there was a couple of fires that happened because of them trying to keep warm inside the stalls, including one in October of 1887 that burnt a lot of the western border of the facility. November of 1887, there's a notice that Robert Moore was building a cottage at the facility. I guess he wanted to stay there as caretaker. Again in June of 1888, the Big Six celebration was held. Estimated 8,000 to 10,000 people again, including your industrial parade. There was an attempted balloon ascension and parachute jump by a Professor Tolbert. Al Tolbert was his name, and he was going to go up in the balloon and then jump out and come back down with a parachute. Unfortunately, it was pretty windy that day, and they wanted to scrub the whole thing, but the crowd was pretty rowdy and insistent that they do it. So they attempted to have the balloon go up. Unfortunately, some pieces of the balloon, parts of it fell and almost killed a local farmer that was underneath. I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh at that, but it's interesting. They were hippodrome racing that day, and from what I could read in the descriptions in the paper, it seems that was riders standing up on the back of 2 horses side by side around the track. There were your sulky horse races. There was a baseball game again, and that was the Big Six celebration for that year. Professor Tolbert did come back during the fair of 1888 in that October. The Big District Fair was held again, and it was a nice, calm, clear day, and he successfully went up in his balloon and parachuted back down. It seems to be the last of the big fairs that were held at the facility. There were also some circuses that would be there from time to time traveling through town, and some other events happened there as well. But the fair organization looked back and basically lost money with each fair that they had, so they canned the idea of having the fairs there. As a matter of fact, in the next year, 1889, they kept the track intact with the amphitheater grandstands area. But the rest of the facility they plowed up and started planting crops to raise funds, use it for farming instead. August 19th, 1895, there were 10 local businessmen purchased the property, and they were under the name of the Cyclone Park Association. The price for that sale was $7,450, and it seems that they used it as another gentleman's horse driving club and used it for their own private events and practices, and says that they held weekly meets there amongst themselves. It was used for other events, including in 1897 bicycle races held there. And in 1900 there was a different club was organized called the Seymour Driving Club. They leased the facility for 3 years for themselves. Again, held weekly meets there during the summertime. In 1901 there was a notification that the Seymour Baseball Club had reorganized and they were leasing property there to play their games. There was a notification in 1906 saying that the grandstands and horse stalls were in deteriorating condition. 1913 there was a notice that called the facility the old driving park, so it seemed to be going downhill. Although in 1917 again they held bicycle racing there. Again, then that brings us to February of 1923, when the property was purchased by some local trustees and became the Stiegelmeyer addition to the city of Seymour. Purchase price was $15,000, but that's a story for another video. So that's the history as I have found it of the Cyclone Driving Park and what all went on there. Interesting, as most things I find of local history are interesting. But in the next video I'm going to talk about the same area, same properties, but we're going to talk about it as becoming a Stiegelmeyer addition to the city and exactly why it was. It's another fascinating story, exactly who Stiegelmeyer was and why, without him ever living in Seymour or actually owning the property, had the addition named after him. I'll also talk about where the names of Carter, Lee, and Kessler Boulevards came from. If you want to do a little research, you might be able to figure out Kessler if you look up the name Kessler in 1923. So I hope you enjoyed this video on the Cyclone Driving Park and its history. If you liked it, give me a thumbs up, that'd be great. If you want to hear more stories like this, hit the subscribe button and you'll get a notification. So thank you for watching and Happy New Year to you. Goodbye. But wait, there's more. I just thought of something that I should have added to this video. I mentioned the fact that the big brick barn over at Johnson and 6th Street was where the Seymour Trotting Association met and had their meets there. There's some speculation that that was a part of the racing track facility, and it really was never a part of the facility. It was not inside the gates or anything like that. The only connection with it is with the Trotting Association, and that the owner of the horses there, owner that kept his horses there, certainly raced his horses at the facility. But again, that'd be a video for warmer weather when I can be over there and show you more of it. Okay, bye.